Good morning and welcome to Light Reflections from First Friends. We are glad you have chosen to join us for this virtual worship service and hope you find it beneficial to your spiritual journey. We consider this an abbreviated version of our in-person meeting for worship for those wishing to join us from a distance. If this is your first time joining us, First Friends is a thriving, progressive Quaker meeting in the city of Indianapolis, Indiana. We consider ourselves a loving, inclusive, joyous gathering of people seeking to know truth under the leadership of God's Spirit. All are welcome, no matter race, age, cultural background, sexual orientation and identity, marital status, physical and mental ability, family structure, or economic circumstance. Our hope is that through this worship experience, you will discover our faith community is unlike any other, where silent meditation is as important as the spoken word, where we emphasize the importance of one's personal encounter with the divine, and where we seek to support one another as we discover truth together. Now we invite you to center down and enter this virtual worship space with us.
Be you to others kind and true, and always unto others do, as you'd have others do to you. Be you to others kind and true, and always unto others do, as you'd have others do to you.
Good morning and welcome to Light Reflections. We are so glad you joined us this morning as we continue our series on Quaker worship. Today's scripture is from 1 Peter 3, 8-9 from the Voice version. Finally, all of you, be like-minded and show sympathy, love, compassion, and humility to and for each other, not paying back evil with evil or insult with insult, but repaying the bad with a blessing. It was this you were called to do, so that you might inherit a blessing. Well, for several months now, I've been reading about a trend that is making significant headlines across our country. That trend is something called leadership empathy. One of my former student leaders at Huntington University posted an article this week that emphasized this by claiming the future to be led by empathy more than power, greed, or status. What I found most interesting is that this leadership trend is being driven by millennials, those born between the early 1980s through the early 2000s. If you weren't aware, during the pandemic, the millennial generation became the largest in the workforce, which also means they are now driving the workforce. I find this interesting since millennials are the first generation statistically not having a clear connection to the organized church. Ironically, we at First Friends are currently finding a surge in millennials, which is clearly not the trend in the church universal right now, and has not been a trend among Quaker meetings whose average age is 65 plus years old. We should be keenly aware that something is happening in our midst. Having 3 millennial sons who work in millennial managed work situations, the concept of leadership empathy is clear. Both Sue and I have said we could learn a lot from this model. Sue mentioned how teaching has lost its empathy in our country, especially during the pandemic, but also over time as education has become more political and business-driven. Sadly, I must agree. And when listening to my fellow pastors across the country each week, it is clear that empathy is often missing within many meetings and churches today. This is when I began to realize and consider how significantly important empathy is to a Quaker worshiping community. But before I get too wrapped up in developing this idea, let's start with defining what is meant by empathy. In the article my student shared, it said this: empathy, well, is complicated, and many people don't understand exactly what it entails. It's more than being nice, and it's much different from sympathy. An empath, someone who practices empathy, is someone who understands what another person is going through by looking at the situation from their perspective. Think about someone who really took time to help you grow. They were most likely an empath. Much like in the business leadership environment, empathy within a religious community is becoming aware of the fellow spiritual seekers we gather with, acknowledging their unique and often complex worship and communication styles, as well as acknowledging that they have lives separate from what is seen when gathered together. An empathetic worship environment is to create a place where the gathered community is able to communicate about stresses, challenges, and uncertainties about their faith, about the divine, and even about their involvement in the local meeting. Someone who studied in detail the millennial generation within the church before she unexpectedly passed away from cerebral edema in 2019 was Rachel Held Evans. She said this. She said, "Most young adults I know aren't looking for a religion that answers all their questions, but rather a community of faith in which they feel safe to ask them." What I believe Rachel was seeking and trying hard to promote and create was more empathetic worship communities. Asking questions is also an important part of the overall worship experience. As Quakers, that is why queries are so essential to our community and faith. Encouraging religious seekers such as you and me to ask questions and look at our faith as something we can fully explore rewards everyone, no matter their generation or age. Yes, at times we will need to wrestle with and provide space to explore answers or outcomes, but embracing an empathetic worship community also means offering people space to use their curiosity and creativity to inspire new ideas and understandings about the divine they may never have thought of. This will mean that an empathetic worship community does not accept the phrase, "We have always done it that way." That is the one single phrase that has killed meetings and churches throughout the ages. It kills curiosity and creativity, it lacks empathy, and does not inspire future hope. Every year in America, we publish a list of top 10 phrases becoming insincere, useless, or cliche. "We have always done it that way" should be number one on a similar list for the universal church. Some others we could put on that list would include "Everything happens for a reason," "God will never give you more than you can handle," "Let go and let God," "You just need to pray about it." Oh, and there are so many more. And sadly, when those phrases fall short, as they always do, we quickly look for an answer or a response instead of empathetically sitting with each other in the issues and seeking the why behind them. The reason I consider empathy as essential to building a Quaker worshiping community is because worship puts our attention on others. It is, as I have been saying for the past 4 weeks, to humble us before the divine for teaching and transformation, love and hope, so that we may experience the empathy of the divine and in turn share that empathy with our neighbors within whom we believe God resides. In some Quaker circles, they have another phrase they use to describe empathy within the worshiping community. They utilize listening beyond words. It is clear when reading the lives and actions of the early Quakers that they were very interested in empathy. Just look at how the majority of them viewed women, slaves, First Nations people, and their fellow friends. In T. Vale Palmer's book, Face to Face, Early Quaker Encounters with the Bible, Palmer makes the case that a deep valuing of empathy played a major role in early Quakers' interpretation of the Bible. Instead of power and position or status, they interpreted the Bible in light of an empathetic spirit that was commanded by Jesus when he focused on loving one's neighbors as themselves. From our very beginning, Friends developed explicit practices for fostering empathy, because even though humans have a capacity for empathy, that does not mean we necessarily pay attention to it. Quaker practices that get to the why, like listening beyond words, opens the way for people to develop deep insights into each other. Empathetic interactions then build connections between people at levels much deeper than perceived judgments and basic information, or what we could say is getting beyond the surface issues and doubts of faith and community. Let's be honest. Attending church is considered one of the most superficial times in the week for people. They come pulling themselves together, yelling at each other, all the way to the meeting house door, and then almost like Disney magic, they enter through the doors on Sunday morning, only to pull off the perfect ruse for an hour or so. I know some of you did it this morning, and probably some others are watching at home because they couldn't pull it together. It's time we entered the meeting house, warts and all, seeking to delve beyond the surface of our lives. So how do we go beyond the surface? Listen beyond words and become a truly empathetic worship community. I want us to begin by focusing on what I will label the 3 A's of worship: attitude, attention, and adjustment. I first came across these studying active listening in a psychology class, and I've adapted them to help us consider what I will call this morning active empathetic worship. Let's begin with attitude. Worship must always begin with having the right attitude. Whether you're coming to meeting for worship, a small group study, or a committee meeting, and remember, all are considered worship among friends. Take a moment to decide if you're emotionally open to the conversations that may ensue, whether with the divine or with your neighbor. Also ask yourself if you're able to devote your attention to what God or your sister or brother may say or ask of you. It's also important to leave your bias at the door and come in with an open mind and heart for where the Spirit may lead. This leads us to attention. Worship among friends demands our undivided attention so that we can hear from God and our neighbor. This is not easy, folks. When we bring our distractions to worship, we may not be able to have the empathy necessary for others or even ourselves. Our distractions then become distractions for our neighbor's worship as well. Ask yourself how you might eliminate the distractions so you can be fully present in worship to God and to your neighbor's needs. And the final A stands for adjustment. One major aspect of Quaker worship is becoming silent, entering a humble posture of deep listening, and then seeking a way to respond to what speaks to one's condition. This means always being open to the fact that things may not go as we may anticipate or desire. Thus, to fully worship and respond, we may need to make some personal adjustments. I find that having empathy for my neighbor often begins with an adjustment in my own heart. I must get myself out of the way before I'm able to speak to the condition of my neighbor or hear from the divine. Early this week, I posted a thought to start our week from Leslie Jameson on my Facebook page. It happened to be on empathy. It received a lot of interaction, and I had many conversations about it. I believe Leslie is speaking to just what I'm talking about here. She says, empathy isn't just something that happens to us, a meteor shower of synapses firing across the brain. It's also a choice we make to pay attention, to extend ourselves. It's made of exertion, that dowdier cousin of impulse. Sometimes we care for another because we know we should or because it's asked for. But this doesn't make our calling hollow. The act of choosing simply means we've committed ourselves to a set of behaviors greater than the sum of our individual inclinations. This confession of effort chafes against the notion that empathy should always rise unbidden, that genuine means the same thing as unwilled, that intentionality is the enemy of love. But I believe in intention, and I believe in work, and I believe in waking up in the middle of the night and packing our bags and leaving our worst selves for our better ones. In this worshiping community, whether during a meeting for worship, fellowship activity, within a committee, or when just having a cup of coffee with a fellow friend? Are we paying attention? Are we extending ourselves? Are we choosing to commit ourselves to a higher way? Are we aware of our attitudes, intention, and need for personal adjustments? To close this teaching on building a Quaker empathetic worship community, I turn to the words of Quaker poet and abolitionist John Greenleaf Whittier, who said, "I'll lift you, and you lift me, and we'll ascend together." Together may we at First Friends ascend in empathy and love for God and one another today. Let us now enter waiting worship and ask ourselves those queries I just read. Am I paying attention? Am I extending myself? Am I choosing to commit myself to a higher way? And am I aware of my attitudes, attention, and need for personal adjustments?
Draw the welcome circle wider, gather friends and strangers in, formed of holy breath and stardust, born of God, we all are kin. From the hedgerows and the highways, summon each unlikely guest, bid the hungry their fill, all the weary find their rest. Draw the welcome circle wider, gather friends and strangers in, formed of holy breath and stardust, born of God, we all are kin. Doors upended serve as tables, where the guests prepare to dine. Justice is their righteous fare, while mercy is their richest wine. Draw the welcome circle wider, gather friends and strangers in, formed of holy breath and stardust, born of God, we all are kin. All our refugees together, all our wanderers welcome home, greeted by God's open arms, with each unique but none alone. Draw the welcome circle wider, gather friends and strangers in, formed of holy breath and stardust, born of God, we all are kin. Streaming through the arching gateway in a bright celestial throng, saints from ages gone before us lead the joyous banquet song.
We close this time of worship with a Quaker prayer. God, open our eyes and unstop our ears, that we may see your light and may hear your heartbeat, reflecting and resounding within our chests, in those of all our neighbors, near and far, in all creatures and plants, and in the ground we walk upon. When we finally are able to yield to the leading of your rhythm and flow, may we come to walk cheerfully over the world, answering that of you in all. Amen. Have a great week, friends.